Now it's all about television and programmatic. So please welcome to the stage Chris Dobson, Executive Chair of the Exchange Lab.
Well, Tom, it looks like we've morphed into each other, but that was a scary moment, wasn't it, for both of us? Well, good morning. The last panel really set me up very well because I had a breakfast with the sales leaders of the leading UK TV stations and networks a couple of months ago, and I have to say that meeting was more confrontational than I would have expected, because what pervaded for some of them, not all of them, was a sense of us and them, a sense of television and programmatic as being adversaries. What I'm going to try and do in the next 20 minutes is show you that actually there's a lot more similar about the way we think about automation in the digital world with television than you may think. So I have an interesting perspective on this. When I showed this presentation to our own company, most of the people in our business weren't born at that first date. I'm glad to believe that I think a few more of you may have been born. But the reality is that the first half of my career was really quite traditional television, and the second half has all been about the digital journey, culminating in my current role at the Exchange Lab, where we're at the sort of leading edge of this programmatic revolution. And thank you for Zenith for sort of providing the halftime refreshments along the way. Going through that journey, though, you get an interesting perspective on how things have changed and how things haven't changed. One thing I firmly believe hasn't changed is that the content, and we saw this earlier from Fox, is at the center of everything in terms of consumers. Great shows are still what consumers flock to, and they flock to them in a very different way than they used to when they all flock to them together in the same room. But it's still about great content. And if you look at these shows, there's more of the shows on this slide from the new disruptors such as Netflix than necessarily from the old networks, but they're both in the same business. That isn't going to change. Great content is sought out by consumers and will always be. There was a question earlier about, from a gentleman from Discovery, I think, about what's happening in the US. Well, TV has sailed along happily whilst every other medium has been overtaken by digital revenue gains. What's interesting on this chart, and this is US data, this is eMarketer's data, is that there are two things you should note for television here. One, the slope is down, so that sort of 50% share is no longer to be relied upon as the generational effects come through. And the more profound one is that by 2018, which isn't very far away, in the US, digital revenues will be larger than television. As you'll see at the end of this, the definitions of that actually become morphed into one. But that is a wake-up call for the traditional television industry, because the traditional television industry still somewhat lives in the great ways of trading that have been done for decades. But when you look at the journey for television and you look at the journey for digital, what you find is actually there's a lot of coincidence and a lot of common themes. When I first worked for television, there were free-to-air networks, they were pretty much monopolies, and they made an awful lot of money. The London franchise in the UK had to be split into weekend and weekdays to make it less powerful. But then came cable and satellite and an explosion of channels which fragmented the audience and made finding the audience much harder than it had been in those early days. Exactly the same has happened in digital. When I was at Microsoft, MSN, AOL, and Yahoo ruled the world before this thing called Google turned up and before this thing called Facebook turned up. And as you can see, the whole aspect of social interaction whilst being involved with content is a crossover point. Now, we've all been disrupted in our various ways. Television is being certainly disrupted by new entrants like Netflix and Amazon. And you'll see where they have an advantage over traditional television in terms of what they can bring to the party in terms of data. One thing that's been very different, obviously, is this massive adoption of automation within the digital side of the business, and really a much more traditional view of how you should trade television. We talked about the upfronts. The upfronts have been going for years. Lots of money deployed against a pretty statistically ropey set of data, frankly. But it's the same for everyone, and therefore it's okay, and it's always done very well, thanks. And there's plenty of golf to be had. That world is changing, and a lot of the TV companies who have a foot in both digital and traditional camps are leading that change. And I think there's a lot of publishers that are showing very, very good leadership skills in moving forward. What's the difference? What's changed all this? You've heard about data. Data is absolutely the center of what marketers and CMOs care about. Because the ability to close that circle, the ability to understand your consumer more effectively than you've understood them before, and then act on that data, creates a fantastic loyalty device. It creates a wonderful way of moving into upsell and cross-sell. And it really allows media to act on CRM data directly. And that hasn't really been the case up until now. So I think everybody so far this morning has talked about data being at the center of the universe. That's absolutely true. But that is a challenge for traditional TV, where data is far less easy to access, unless you're someone like Netflix. Those of you who use Netflix know that on whatever screen you're accessing their service, it asks you who you are. And you're more than willing to tell them who you are, because that then surfaces your content. So if and when, and as Martin Sorrell said a week or so ago, he fully expects Netflix to have to move into an advertising model, they will have a wealth of data about, they already have a wealth of data about their consumers that traditional TV just can't touch. And that data gap is something which traditional linear television has got to overcome in order to be fully integrated into this new way of thinking. And why is it important? Let me just give you a very simplistic example, and you know all this, but I'll go through it anyway. From my perspective, the first-party data that you as marketers and brands have within your organization is the holy grail of competitive advantage. We all most of us flew here. Let's think about the journey that I had. I bought a ticket from British Airways, and when I bought that ticket, I knew when I was flying, and I knew where I was going. They knew the same. None of their competitors knew that. So if you can use that to your advantage, by upselling me a hotel, by creating loyalty, by being involved with things that I might want to be involved with at the destination where I'm going, you add real value to that customer relationship, and you create loyalty. And your competitors couldn't break in because they didn't own that first-party data. And I think a lot of what you hear around concerns around which direction you should go as marketers is about the sanctity of that first-party data. How ring-fenced is it? Is it being used for your advantage, or is it being used for others' advantage? How sure can you be? And that's led to a lot more clients, some of which are in this room, moving into a much more direct relationship with the way that they deal with their data and the way that they join that circle to activate media on the back of it. Now, you've heard, I think, a number of people have described inventory, especially in digital inventory, as first class, business class, and coach. It's something which we used when I was at BBC Worldwide to describe our long tail, if you like, compared with the premium end of what we were selling. But if you think about it, television has used the same definitions. And on this chart, you can see that premium digital, which is becoming more and more available in an automated programmatic space, is equivalent to peak as far as TV is concerned. And you can see that daytime and nighttime is really the zero rating long tail of television that's always been in existence since television went 24 hours. And funnily enough, when you tune in at night on television, what do you see? You see direct response. Because it's not about the ratings, it's about eliciting a response and paying for that response. That's exactly where programmatic began, because that was the inventory that was available. What's happening now is much more premium inventory is coming into the space. It's being traded in a more automated way, and as such, more and more brand budgets are being traded in the programmatic marketplace. That's set to continue if the programmatic marketplace does a few things to help that journey. But if you're just thinking about the comparison between television and programmatic, it's not that different. The definitions of value in terms of the product that's created and the consumer relationship are the same. And funnily enough, those of you who are nostalgic will recognize the Thames TV logo at the top there. I first worked for Thames, and Thames was one of those London contractors that was so powerful that it had to have the weekends taken away from it. But the way we traded television in the mid-80s was reacting to overnight data that then we changed the campaign going forward to make sure that it was still on track. So that we were changing and preempting spots out of prime locations to maintain performance. Doesn't sound too unfamiliar, does it? That's exactly what happens in the programmatic space, on the basis of data that happens in much more real time necessarily than overnight. But it's the same principle. The only difference was that in the television land that I lived in then, we did it entirely manually, and of course we did it against a finite inventory. So there was a second deal about juggling the trading to make sure that you didn't overtrade. But the principle was the same. If you then start looking in a little bit more detail about how do digital and TV think of themselves, what are the important things that they should care about? And you go down these lists and you see there are strengths and weaknesses. You see that they've all operated in a reasonably similar way. Some of the big differences, as I've said, are around the availability of data. One of the big differences is the ability to react to what consumers are telling you and showing you is happening in terms of their interaction with your brands. That's something where you can do in near real time in today's programmatic world. It's a bit slower in the television world. However, television is moving in that direction because most large television companies are a digital company as well. And the interest that they have in joining the dots of that final screen serves the same purpose for their business as it does for anyone else. Targeting, and we heard this on the panel though, is absolutely key. In the early days of digital, the context of being able to put an ad in an environment was fine. But if you could precisely target an audience and be sure there was no wastage and no leakage, you could do a lot of things with your creativity. One of the bank examples would be that if you were trying to recruit Premier Banking, you wouldn't want to show that to students. And if you were trying to recruit students, you wouldn't want your Premier Banking customers to see that different type of creative. It was doing a different thing, projecting a different image. In television, you don't get that choice. One of the guys in the UK said, which I thought was interesting, we are very good at targeting, quote unquote. You get the audience you buy, and then you get all the other audiences for free. I didn't think that was really going to wash in today's laser precision marketing that we're all involved with, and it is an issue. But you can see what part of the issue is slightly being in denial. Multinational is something which television has always done pretty well in some instances, but in a very data-free zone. Whereas multinational in the programmatic world is really pretty easy. You know, we can run campaigns in countries that we don't actually have any people physically present because it's very easy to do. One big advantage, though, that TV has over the programmatic world is in that last point. Scalable models for advertisers. We've talked about transparency. you all worry, and your procurement departments worry about margins, and they worry about how much of an advertising dollar is going to tech cost and how much is actually buying audience. Well, in television, you can deploy $1 billion and be pretty sure that the vast majority of that $1 billion has bought airtime. The big change for the movement and combination, if you like, of that final screen into a programmatic space will happen when our industry doesn't try to convince you that 50% of that $1 billion is a tech fee. And there's a catch-22 about the movement of those large branding dollars into a more automated way of trading and all the advantages that that brings with the reality of the industry normalizing the way it's compared with other media. So there's work to be done. There's work to be done on a lot of other things too, but actually a lot of them are common. Viewability is a great problem to have now because it really says that you as brand marketers are putting brand money into the digital marketplace. Because viewability isn't so much of an issue if it's DR. If we buy twice as much of inventory as we need to deliver your CPA, that's our problem. If you're buying real consumers and you're not convinced that half of them are seeing the ad or have the opportunity to see the ad, then that's an issue. But to be honest, it's always been an issue. If you buy media in London in the old days, you had people with a clipboard in Newcastle writing down whether the ads went out because you couldn't see whether those ads went out. The definition of a reader in the National Readership Survey is incredibly spurious. 2 minutes of a front page says you're a reader. Well, if you've bought an ad in a colour supplement deep in that Sunday paper, are you really sure that there was viewing going on? Outdoor, equally challenged. And as we've got into the digital space, viewability has become even more an important component and even more data-driven and able to use technology in a bad way. And it really is an ongoing war. You know, whether there are 5 ads served into an ad placement and only the top one is the one that's real, but all 5 are being bought, is a problem that needs to be solved. But it's a problem for all of us. The other one is, how do you bring cross-device and data together? Now, we can do it in some ways. TV Sync is an interesting way where an auction goes on the device on your lap related to the ad you're seeing on TV in real time. But it's just a start of real cross-device integration. And the problem is that we all have different data standards. We've got the traditional ways. In the US, they only went to break ratings in the last 5 minutes, comparatively. So there's a lot of work to be done to get to the same data set. We all know that's hard enough between mobile and desktop in digital. It will be even harder as we bring television in. It's something we do have to fix. So how do you bring all this together? Well, the first thing, and you've heard these 3 themes, is about workflow. There are 50 billion digital impressions in play every day. You cannot buy them manually. It's impossible. You can't keep throwing graduates at it. They won't be able to cope. This graph shows how our technology, Proteus, our trading platform and our management platform, saves a hell of a lot of time. The first bar is the time to run a campaign on one DSP, one source of inventory. The third one is what happens if you want to buy 5. Now, if you buy 5, you get much better results, but you can't scale the business on that basis. The final one, though, is buying 5 using a platform like Proteus as the technology to enable that. So it's all about scalability. The next one is about judging value. This is about understanding what media you're buying is doing and how consumers are reacting to it. This is a sample report that has been made for one of our clients, and it's bespoke to their requirements. It's bespoke to the way it fits into their business. But they can see which parts of what we're doing are providing the best results. We can see it too, and it fuels the way that we move on to the next campaign. But once you've judged the value, you've got to be able to act on it. and you've got to be able to act on it in real time. This is a shot of our trading platform, which allows us to take that data and make changes to campaigns across multiple DSPs right from this screen. It's a bit like a Bloomberg, if you like, in the finance world. But you have to be able to do this to be able to scale. And when we bring television in with a lot more complexity, then without the technology layer to make it happen, we're in real problem. So moving to the end then, what are the blockers for television moving in this direction? Well, I think the first one's obvious. It's not broke, so we're not going to fix it. Well, it's sort of going to be broken soon, so best get ahead of that curve. The tech costs are a real issue. I've talked about those. Can real-time bidding actually make you more money? Can putting an auction into the center break of the Super Bowl and letting it run right up to the time of transmission make you more money than pre-selling it? Generally, the answer to that would probably be yes, but it has to be proved. And of course, where is the trading platform like Proteus in order to make you do this? Now, the enablers are very powerful. Most television companies are digital companies as well. They need to join their own dots. They absolutely have to play with proving ROI through much more effective data integration. And you as clients want that final screen to be in, not out. Consumers don't think of those screens any differently. Why should we as marketers or vendors? And actually, of course, if your platform starts to burn and your TV revenues start to go down and your ratings start to go down and the old model doesn't quite work like it does, then you will move. But ultimately, Amazon and Netflix will force the issue because they will have advantages over traditional TV that will force that content to be in play in a different way to get the value back. And this, you know, this was a funny slide in Singapore because you can't buy a Bentley for anything like that, even second-hand. And in deference to our next speaker from Aston, there's no way I'm sure you can buy an Aston on eBay. But you know that more often than not, in the flurry of an auction, the price gets higher than it does if you bought it a week or so before. The belief in that model, which works obviously for eBay and works for eBay's media too, is something which has to be proven. So ultimately, it's very simple. We call things TV and digital today, and there's a crossover. In the not too distant future, those definitions become invalid. And we'll be thinking of all these things as being exactly the same. So there's much more in common between television and digital, and between the way to trade through a semi-automated, data-driven space. But the television industry is approaching a point where it really doesn't want to be a follower too far behind the curve. And I think in the next 2 or 3 years, you're going to see a real change driven by many of the marketers in this room. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. Much appreciated. Very insightful indeed, and kind of falling nicely onto how digital and television plays out together. We are up in time, but I just want to see if there was one question out there. It was a pretty insightful presentation, so I'm guessing. Okay.
All clear.
Okay. Well, let's give a big round of applause to Chris. Thank you very much.